So I recently made a game for Ludum Dare 46. In case you've never watched the Brackeys intro, Ludum Dare is a huge game development competition where you get either 48 or 72 hours to make a game. I've participated in a few game jams before, and normally I use a game engine like Unity to create my entries, since having all of this gives you a huge head start compared to creating everything from scratch. But for this jam, I decided to give my small brain an extra challenge. I had to create my entry with just C++ and a library for graphics. I ended up using a great C library called raylib for graphics and input. A link to it will be available in the description. I made a simple game with an egg that you have to launch between platforms to avoid falling in lava. I managed to finish and submit my game right before the 72-hour deadline, but I wasn't able to upload a web build in time. This meant that if someone wanted to play my game, they would have to download it. I don't think anyone would want to spend their time downloading this when they could just play better entries in their web browser. So I checked the rules, and apparently porting your game to other platforms after the deadline is not only allowed, but also encouraged. So I added my web build, and this gave me the really dumb idea that you already know if you read the title of this video. Since my game pretty much only relies on standard C++ functions, it could probably compile to just about any platform with only a few changes. So I thought it would be interesting to try to port my game to as many consoles as I could. Out of curiosity, I went to my games page on the Ludum Dare website and checked what the possible options were when listing the platforms your game supports. It turns out there are options for literally every single console, even consoles that don't exist yet. So this pretty much sealed the deal for my crazy idea. Before I go over how I ported my game to all of these consoles, I should probably explain how the code behind it works. The game logic is pretty simple. The egg's position is constantly changing based on a velocity variable, which is constantly increasing by a constant that represents the acceleration of gravity. When you press down on the mouse button, the cursor's position is stored in two variables, mouse down x and mouse down y. Then when you release the button, I set the velocity's x component to the distance between mouse down x and the cursor's current x position, and the velocity's y component to the distance between mouse down y and the cursor's y position. And that, combined with some really long if statements for collision detection, makes for a kind of fun, kind of broken game. So here's a list of all the consoles I'm going to attempt to port my game to. I picked these ones because they all first of all have C++ libraries and are consoles that I own, but they also each have interesting limitations that I think will be fun to try to work around. All of the libraries I use for each console port will be linked in the description. I'm going to start with the PS Vita because I think it'll be the easiest. Its screen resolution is very close to the resolution of the original game, and it's a fairly modern console, so memory and performance shouldn't be an issue. I started off by commenting out all of the functions that needed to be replaced, like loading and drawing sprites, fonts, and sounds. Then I went through the code and slowly started replacing stuff. First I replaced raylib sprite loading functions with the Vita2D functions, then I replaced all of the functions for drawing sprites to the screen. Then, after replacing code for drawing a line, I realized I should probably try compiling all of this. It looks like I missed a few things. Wait, it actually works? I didn't actually expect the porting process to be as straightforward as I thought, so I was honestly pretty surprised. Something that really stood out to me when testing for the first time was how nice it felt to play. And after that, I re-added the UI text, which Vita2D's font support made really easy, and also re-added sound effects using a Vita port of an audio library called So Loud. And with that, my game was now working on the PlayStation Vita. I added a download link to the game's page and was pretty excited to keep going. Finishing the Vita port gave me a lot of motivation, so I decided to take on a console that would be a little more complicated next: the Nintendo DS. The most apparent issue is that the DS's screen resolution is a lot smaller than the game's resolution, and its 2D rendering capabilities are pretty limiting. So I had to make some changes to the game's sprites. I played around in GIMP and determined how much smaller I should make the sprites and decided to make them half of their current size. And after adjusting my sprites and porting over the Vita code, I came across my next issue. The DS graphics library I'm using doesn't have support for drawing lines, and without a line to somewhat guide the player, the game will be even more unfair than it already is. So being the smart person that I am, I came up with a clean and efficient workaround. My original plan was to create a dotted line out of sprites. I made a prototype of the effect I was aiming for in Unity. You can set any number of points and it'll distribute those points along a line. But then, a terrible, sinister thought came into my mind. What if I set the number of dots to something huge? It would just look like a normal line. No one would be able to tell the difference. So yeah, I made a line renderer that works by drawing 101 textures of a square to the screen on a console with 4 MB of RAM. It doesn't affect performance, so we can just pretend like it doesn't exist. The last thing I had to do was implement the UI. The DS library I'm using does have support for simple 8x8 or 8x16 fonts, but for this game that won't really work too well. So instead, I made sprites for all of the text in the game. For the score, I made sprites for each digit and used modulus to determine which sprites display on the screen. And I did the same thing for the high score. And then slapped some sound effects on and another platform on the game's Ludum Dare page. I really like how the DS port turned out. The touchscreen acts kind of like a trackpad, and I think this control scheme ended up being the best way to control the game. Speaking of ways of controlling the game, the next platform I decided to target was the Wii. And oh boy, isn't this control scheme just great. Right away I had a problem. There were so many different options for graphics libraries, and I had no idea which one I should use. So being the responsible person that I am, I picked a random one. ldjam. Turns out I would deeply regret this choice later on. So using the Vita port as a base, I started commenting out code and adding some initialization stuff and button input. And then I quickly compiled everything to see if I was on the right track, and oh let me just delete that Vita 2D header. And after that, I only had one screen worth of errors, which was a pretty big milestone for me. So there I was with my code on one monitor and a screenshot of the errors in Microsoft Paint on the other, going through and fixing all of my dumb mistakes. And now that I had some sort of code compiling, it was just a matter of replacing everything else. I replaced all the functions for drawing sprites, and pretty quickly I came across an issue. ldjam also didn't have support for drawing lines. Sure, I could do the same thing I did with the DS port, but I didn't really want to start a trend of having unsophisticated, hacked together code. ldjam does have support for drawing rectangles, so I thought I could be clever and make a line by using a skinny rectangle and some trigonometry. But, yeah. Let's just go ahead and delete that. I searched around, and apparently a decade ago, someone made an extension for ldjam with line drawing support, but there was no download link or any mention of it on the internet outside of this wiki page. I even reached out to the author, and he had no idea what I was talking about. So I figured my best bet was to just ditch this entire ancient library from 2008. I reached out to a friend of mine on Twitter who does a lot of cool 3D Wii development, and he recommended that I use grrrlib, or grrlib. It didn't take very long to install the library and edit my code to use grrlib. And then I just added sound effects and UI, which was made even easier because grrlib also has support for TTF font rendering. Overall, this definitely isn't the best way to play the game, but I'm happy with how it turned out. I could have probably made the controls better. Using IR to track the relative motion of the Wiimote doesn't make a lot of sense. Using motion controls probably would have been a better method. The last two consoles I wanted to port my game to were the GameCube and the PSP. Neither of these have touchscreens, so I thought it would be interesting to try to create a decent control scheme for the game using only buttons. I'll start off with the GameCube port. Thanks to this king who ported GRRlib to the GameCube, all I really had to do was take the code for the Wii port and change the controls. So I found an old but relevant explanation of GameCube controller input. I created two integers to represent an imaginary cursor's X and Y positions, and added the X and Y values of the GameCube analog stick to these every frame. This basically creates a virtual invisible cursor that works perfectly with the existing code. Yeah, I don't think that's gonna come back down. So maybe just tone this down a bit. I made a few other tweaks and now the game had decent controls. And yeah, that's literally it. That's the entire GameCube port. The audio and everything else from the Wii version is also compatible with the GameCube, so it just works. All that's left now is the PSP port. Oh boy. Things started out relatively well. I decided to use a graphics library called glib2d since none of the other ones worked. I used the Vita port as a base and replaced the functions for image loading, image drawing, and modified the GameCube code for input. Another thing I had to do was reduce the size of the sprites to compensate for the PSP's smaller screen resolution. And because I did that, I also had to pretty much divide everything related to pixels in the game's code by 2, such as gravity, the width and height of objects colliders, and even the fall speed of platforms, as well as other weird and specific parts of my code. This is something I also had to do for the DS port, but I didn't want to go into too much detail about it then, since the DS port had enough to worry about without it. And after compiling, the basics of the game worked pretty well. But then, I had to implement audio. For some reason, there are no SDK examples for loading any audio format other than this MP3 loading sample from 10 years ago. So, as a small-brained coder, I didn't really have a choice. I converted all of my sound effects to MP3, integrated the MP3 example into my game, and after 7 hours of troubleshooting, it lags whenever sound is played. So I decided to just turn off audio by default and allow the player to enable it by pressing select on the splash screen. Quick tip, you probably don't want to press select. At this point, I was really sick of these decade-old examples and didn't even want to mess with font loading, so I just did what I did with the DS port and converted all of my text to sprites and drew it all that way. And at 7 AM, the PSP port was... I mean, it's functional, I guess. Before doing all of this, the PSP pretty much served as a paperweight on my desk, but I'm probably going to put it in my drawer now so I'm not reminded of this traumatic experience. And with that, the download section for Terrified on the Ludum Dare website was looking kind of thick. I don't think people are actually going to play most of these ports, and I don't really blame them, but it's all about the journey. Porting my game to all of these platforms was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed coming up with solutions to the unique problems each console brought. But if you do want to check out the game, I'll link to the download page in the description. I think the definitive version is either the DS or the PS Vita port. And that's everything. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it gave you some sort of insight on what it's like to port projects to these different platforms. I definitely learned a lot about developing for these consoles through this, and definitely want to keep making projects for most of them in the future. As always, feel free to comment any feedback or suggestions you might have for future videos. I'm finally done with exams and schoolwork, so the gaps between my videos should become a lot smaller. I've also been trying to post more interesting content on Twitter, so check that out if you're interested. For example, a few days ago I got a tech support scammer who claimed to be from Microsoft to play and review one of my games, and the conversation was interesting. I'll probably continue to post shorter videos and tutorials that don't really fit on my YouTube channel to Twitter. That's all, so thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.